Today we're going to look at different things that we can do with these new subjunctive forms that we've learned. So last time we learned the four tenses of the subjunctive, but we didn't really do anything with them and we certainly didn't translate them. Today we get to start doing that. Now, one of the things that I mentioned before is that subjunctives tend to be used in what we call dependent or subordinate clauses. That is, a clause that's not the main verb of the sentence. And this is where we will normally see subjunctives. But there are four and only four, independent uses of the subjunctive. And by independent, I mean these are sentences where the subjunctive will be the main verb in the sentence. So these are not super common, but we do see them. In particular, we see one of them fairly often. And so it's important for us to be able to recognize those situations where we run into them. The four different kinds are exhortations, which I'll explain in a minute, which we tend only to see in the first and third person or in a negative second person, and we'll see why in just a moment. Something called deliberative questions. So these are easy to identify because they will always have a question mark at the end, and your main verb will be in the subjunctive. And really, that's the only thing it can possibly be. We also have things that are wishes, and then we have something called the potential subjunctive. So let's go through these one by one. Exhortations are really a kind of imperative. If you remember, we have imperative forms for the second person, singular and plural. So if we want to boss someone around, we say, tradite, hand it over. Or we say, dic, speak. But we don't have imperative forms for the first person or the third person, and that's because in those situations we use the subjunctive. And we don't really think about there being ways to order people around in the first person or third person, but that's because in English we use this form let's. And this is really how we're going to translate these forms usually. So when we say something like, let's have dinner together tonight, or let him go by himself. Those are really imperative forms. Exhortations, you're encouraging somebody to do something, either yourself or a third person. And in those situations, Latin uses the subjunctive, usually the present subjunctive, which makes sense, right? So you can see I've given you some examples here. Eamos, right, from the present subjunctive of eo, let's go. Or this is something we say in class, incipiamos, let's start. But we can also do it in the third person, so something like, Marcus hoc faciat, let Marcus do it, right? So those are situations where really we're trying to encourage somebody, either ourselves or somebody else, to do something, and we use the present subjunctive for it. We do sometimes want to use a negative, and so the negative that we're going to use in this situation is ne. So if we say, ne Marcum sequamur, let's not follow Marcus. Right here, sequamur is in the present subjunctive, Marcus is our direct object. And we've got this ne here that tells us we're not going to do it. Ne Marcum sequamur. You can also see when we use a negative, right, we can have either the present subjunctive or rarely, it's not nearly as common, the perfect subjunctive. But most of the time with exhortations, either positive or negative, you'll see the present subjunctive. But here you could say, ne hoc facias, or ne hoc, that should be feceris, right? Don't do it, right? Ne hoc facias. Don't do it. Don't bother doing it. Now, you did learn that there's another way to do a negative second person imperative, and that's with noli, right? You could just say something like noli facere, don't do it. And these are really equivalent. But ne facias would be slightly more polite. No li facere is kind of bossier. So, but they're essentially equivalent. So that's one thing we can do with the subjunctive, almost always the present subjunctive, and I think it makes a certain amount of sense. We do this kind of thing in English, just with a different construction. The second thing that you can do with the subjunctive as your main verb is ask questions. And so these are often rhetorical questions, so they're not real questions, right? I'm not saying to you, did you do your homework? That would be something where we would use the indicative. They're more sort of theoretical, hypothetical questions. And so, like exhortations, they tend to appear in the first or third person, where, you're sort of asking yourself, oh, should I do that? Would he ever want that? Right? Questions like that where you're trying to figure something out, not something where I'm saying, do you have your book, which is just a factual question. So if it's a hypothetical question, a kind of rhetorical question, often in the first or third person, then that's something where we would often use the subjunctive. And I've given you again some examples. Now we can use any tense really, but most often we're going to use a present subjunctive if we're talking about something sort of for the present or the future, and then maybe the imperfect subjunctive if we're talking about past. So imperfect would be past, and present subjunctive for sort of a present or future situation. Okay? So quid faciam? What am I to do, right? You're in this moment of indecision. It's hypothetical. You don't know what to do. Quid faciam? Or, ubi poeta ad? Where should the poet go? I don't know. I can't decide. Quom modo vivamus? How are we to live? How should we live? Or, in the imperfect here, quid faceret? What was he to do? What could he do? You can see that for these questions, there's no single way that's best to translate them. And so, and this is because in English, we are terrible at using the subjunctive. We don't really use the subjunctive much anymore. So we convey it by different combinations of words. So what am I to do? Where should the poet go? How are we to live? What was he to do, right? And you might use words like could or would in addition to should, might, may. But these are all things that you can sort of keep in mind when you're translating the subjunctive. The important thing to remember is that it's hypothetical, it's not real, and so as long as you translate it in a way that makes clear that this is not a real situation, right? Quid faciam, for example, does not mean what am I doing? It never means that, right? That would be quid facio. You have to include some way of conveying that uncertainty. What am I to do? What should I do? What might I do? Quid faciam. Okay? But you can always identify deliberatives because they're questions, and so you'll have a question mark. Our third kind of independent use are wishes. If you think about it, when you express a wish for the future or for the present or for the past, what you're really doing is saying that there's something that's not the case that you wish were the case, right? So you're hoping for something, you're desiring something that isn't in fact true right now. And that's why we use the subjunctive in Latin. So there's this sort of formula we can use. We use a present subjunctive when we're talking about the future. And bear with me because I'll show you what this looks like. Imperfect expresses wishes for the present, and pluperfect expresses wishes for the past. And you'll see how this works. Often, we have no trigger word that indicates that what we're looking at is a wish, although the content will often show us that it's a wish. But sometimes we do actually get some words that'll help. So sometimes we get something like, oh, see, oh, if only, or utinam, which means something, usually we translate utinam as something like would that. That's very archaic language. But, and welim for a future, or welem for a present or past wish, which we're not really going to translate. We're just going to, it just shows us that what we have is a wish. Negatives are introduced by ne or utinam ne, and occasionally by nolim and nolem, just like we have welem and welem, right, for a negative. These are, I would say, these are much less common. You're most likely to see utinam, osi, or in the negative ne, or utinam ne, or nothing at all for the positives. But let's look at some examples. So, for example, Diu regina vivat, long live the queen. Or we could say something like, may the queen live long, for a long time, right? It's a wish. You're hoping that that would, or you could even say something like, I hope the queen lives a long time, right? That idea that there's a wish for the future. You can also, here you can see in the next example, I have utinam, and here we have the imperfect subjunctive. This is a wish for the present. Utinam mortua esem. I wish I were dead right now, today, right? So this is a wish for the present. We're using the imperfect subjunctive, but it's really conveying that it's not that I wish that I will be dead tomorrow. It's I wish I were dead right now. Utina mortua esem. And you can see in the next example, I have osi, and then here we have the pluperfect. So this is a wish for the past. Osi veniset. If only he had come yesterday. So these likewise are showing, it shows a past wish, right? Something that didn't happen yesterday, but I wish really had happened yesterday. Again, you can see that there's no single way to translate these wishes. You could say may, you could say I wish, you could say if only, anything that conveys the sense that you're wanting something that is hypothetical, right? Something that hasn't actually happened or didn't actually happen. In the negative, you can see a similar kind of thing. In the first one, I just have ne here. Ne Roma deleatur. May Rome not be destroyed. I hope Rome won't be destroyed. A wish for the future. You can see here, nolem I'm using with the imperfect subjunctive. So this is a wish for the present. Nolem meus vir abesset. How I wish my husband were not absent right now. Right? Nolem meus vir abesset. And in the past, you can see I've used utinam ne plus a pluperfect subjunctive. Utinam ne ducem interfeciset. If only he had not killed the leader yesterday in the past, right? So these follow a really predictable order. And when I'm giving them to you, I will always use something like osi or utinam, because that just makes it clearer for you. And often you actually will see those words. Finally is the potential subjunctive. If you have a subjunctive as the main verb of a sentence, and it is not an exhortation, which is usually pretty clear, and it's not a question because there's no question mark at the end, which is also pretty clear, and you're pretty sure it's not a wish for either the future, the present, or the past, then your only option left is the potential subjunctive. This is when you use the subjunctive in a hypothetical situation as the main verb of your sentence. People always want to go straight to the potential subjunctive, but really it's not terribly common. Latin has a lot of other ways of expressing these kinds of ideas. But we do this in English frequently to use something, a word like would or could or should or may or might as the main verb of a sentence to show that we're not sure what's going to happen. But you aren't wishing for it to happen. You're not encouraging it to happen. It's just sort of, well, it could happen. It might rain, right? There you're not wishing for rain. You're not encouraging it to rain. You're just saying, I'm not sure. It might rain. In these situations, we always use non as our negative, not ne. And so that's always a hint, too, that you have a potential subjunctive. For present and future possibilities, things that may happen now or in the future, we use either the present or the perfect subjunctive, usually the present. And for things that could have been possibilities in the past, we usually use the imperfect subjunctive, although you can see the pluperfect subjunctive, but honestly I'm going to put it in brackets because it's not terribly common. But your book mentions it, so you might see it. Okay? Let's look at some examples. So here you can see a present subjunctive, right? Nolum tibi nocere. I wouldn't want to hurt you, right? It's so you get that sense of the hypothetical, that would. So it's not nolo tibi nocere, I don't want to hurt you, right? It's sort of more unsure than that. Nolum tibi nocere, I wouldn't want to hurt you. Again, in the present subjunctive, hoc dicat. He may say that. He may not. I don't know. Hoc dicat. So a hypothetical situation, a situation in which the speaker is unsure. Here I've given an example of a perfect subjunctive. We're really not going to translate it any differently than the present subjunctive. Mentitissimus. We could lie. We might lie. Right? So again, this is a situation where it's hypothetical, unsure. You can't be sure if I'm lying or not. Mentitissimus. And finally, an example in the imperfect subjunctive. So this is something that's definitely indicating something that happened in the past. Putarem te amabilem esse. I would have thought you were nice yesterday, but now I'm not so sure. Putarem. So you can see these are situations where, again, we use words like would, could, may, might, should. English is not very good, American English in particular, it's not very good or careful about talking about different kinds of helping verbs that show a subjunctive idea. We tend to mix them up into a jumble. And so I think as long as you're showing that you're indicating that there is a hypothetical or unsure situation, you're probably in good shape. So finally, to sum up, the subjunctive can be used as the main verb in a sentence when we're talking about some kind of hypothetical situation, a situation where we're unsure about the outcome. It's not the most common way we're going to see the subjunctive, which is more common in dependent or subordinate clauses. But there are these 4 ways where we sometimes see them being used as the main verb of the sentence. We have exhortations, which tend to be in the first person or the third person, and we tend to translate them with the word let, right? Let's go, or let him do it. And we tend to use the present subjunctive in those situations. We also have deliberative questions. These are always going to have a question mark at the end, so you know that it's a deliberative question. And again, we're going to translate it in a way that shows that it's not a fact. It's something that might or should happen. Usually it's in the present subjunctive, but you might see an imperfect or something like that. Wishes are exactly what they sound like. They're wishes for the future. These are slightly trickier to identify, but often we'll see something like OC or utinam that will clue us into the fact that what we have is a wish. And then we just want to make sure that we are conveying the sense that this is something that we're hoping for. We use the present subjunctive for wishes for the future, imperfect subjunctive for wishes for the present, pluperfect subjunctive for wishes for the past. And finally, if it's none of those, then what we have is a potential subjunctive. We can see a potential subjunctive in any tense of the subjunctive, and we just want to make sure that we're translating it with that might, could, would, should idea. We tend to see present and perfect subjunctive for situations that are in the present or future, and imperfect and very rarely pluperfect subjunctive for things that might have happened in the past. So for homework, please do send me up to 3 questions that you may have about these independent uses of the subjunctive. We're going to do sentences 1 through 10 on page 270, and we'll take a look at those in class.